The words no child should have to whisper. Will her plea for her brother's side shatter an officer's rules? They were invisible at the edge of autumn. An aging officer, his loyal German shepherd, and two children the world chose not to see. But when one morning's silence was broken by a child's trembling plea, "Don't take my brother from me," the whole town would be forced to remember what it means to be human. Before this story ends, you'll witness how small acts of kindness ripple outward, how a single, quiet dog can change a fate, and why some families are found, not born. Don't look away. This is how hearts are healed. The morning in Hallow Creek began the way old men remember their best days. Quiet, slow, not needing to prove anything. Mist curled over the lake like a pale scarf, wrapping the water's edges and softening every sound into a secret. The world was all amber and gray, the gold of dying leaves clinging to branches, the silver hush of fog, and the barest thread of sun drifting through the clouds. On the east path, beneath a stand of sugar maples, Officer Jackson R. Miles walked with his hands deep in the pockets of a faded brown coat. The sleeves were worn at the elbows. His boots, though kept clean, were cracked along the sides from years of weather and walking. At 45, Jackson had the kind of posture that belonged to men who carried too much history in their shoulders. Straight but tired, strong but careful. His hair was still mostly black, with gray gathering at his temples and in the lines above his ears. His eyes, a soft green like river glass, seemed always to be watching something just out of reach. Beside him padded Bishop, the old German shepherd. 7 years ago, Bishop had worked disasters, searching rubble after fires and floods, once pulling a lost boy out of a sinkhole in a storm. Now, his step had slowed, his right hind leg moving with a gentle hitch, the scar across his left ear just a pale seam in the short fur. He never wore the K9 harness anymore. His badge was memory and habit, not leather and metal. He walked close to Jackson, body pressed just near enough for both warmth and silent comfort. No one else was out this early. Even the ducks seemed to wait for the sun, clustered at the far end of the water, their calls muffled in the mist. The only sounds were the slow, careful tread of two old friends, the officer and his dog, making their way through a world not quite awake. They did this every morning. Some people in town thought it was routine, just another patrol, an old habit that neither had learned to quit. But there was no hurry to Jackson's steps, no glance at his watch, no sharp whistle to call Bishop along. They stopped sometimes for nothing at all, a shape in the reeds, the ripple of a fish, a single feather on the path. Bishop would pause, ears tilted, eyes soft. Jackson would kneel, brush his palm across the dog's head, and in that gesture, there was something like a prayer. On the far side of the park, the trees grew closer, branches arching together in a quiet cathedral of gold. Here the path turned to gravel, the stones clicking under Jackson's boots. Bishop led a little now, his nose low to the ground, tail moving in a slow arc. There was no destination, just the gentle act of being together. Two creatures once called heroes, now mostly left to their own company. Sometimes, children on their way to the school bus would wave to Jackson, their voices high and shy in the morning air. Some would call out, "Hi, Officer Miles. Hi, Bishop." But today the park was empty. The world, it seemed, was saving its noise for someone else. Jackson glanced down at his companion. Bishop's ears flicked, catching the smallest rustle, the faintest breath of wind. There was a dignity in the dog's silence, a steadiness that Jackson understood better than most. They had both been needed once. They had both stood at the center of things, but time, as it does, had shifted them to the edges, and neither complained. They stopped at a bench overlooking the lake. Jackson sat, elbows resting on his knees, letting the cold seep through the denim and into bone. Bishop sat at his feet, chest rising and falling in slow, even rhythm. Jackson watched the surface of the water, the way the mist drifted, the way the morning light caught on the trembling gold of leaves barely holding on. He thought, not for the first time, of the house at the far edge of town, of quiet rooms and the hush that filled them. There was a photograph on the mantel, a girl's hand in his, the two of them laughing, sunlight tangled in their hair. Sometimes Jackson wondered if anyone remembered the sound of that laugh, if grief left a mark that others could see. Sometimes he believed only Bishop did. A blue jay landed on the back of the bench, cocked its head, and flew off again. Bishop followed it with his eyes, then looked up at Jackson. The dog's muzzle had grown white around the mouth, but his gaze was steady, expectant. There was something in that look, a question perhaps, or just a reminder. We are still here. We are still together. Jackson exhaled, slow and long. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the damp air settle on his face. When he opened them, he saw nothing but the soft gray of the morning and the outline of Bishop, waiting, always waiting. The rest of the town would wake soon. People would fill the sidewalks, voices rising, cars humming, the world remembering itself into activity. But for now, in this pause, this slice of quiet that belonged to the old, the weary and the overlooked, there was only the hush of water, the hush of pause, and the breath of two lives walking beside one another. Bishop nudged Jackson's knee. Just once. Just enough. Jackson smiled, barely a shift at the corner of his mouth. He stood, brushed a fallen leaf from Bishop's back, and together they turned down the path, the autumn mist folding gently around them as they moved toward whatever the day might bring. It was always the willows that held the first hush of fall. Down by the narrowest bend of Hallow Creek, their long branches swept the ground in loose curtains, pooling mist and shadow beneath the faded gold. On mornings like this, the grass kept the chill of the night, and the dew on the leaves shivered as if the earth itself was uncertain whether to hold on or let go. Bishop reached the place first, his gait shifting from gentle amble to something more pointed. He paused at the split in the trail, nose lifted, drawing in the sharpness of a world just waking up. For a moment, Jackson thought it was a squirrel or maybe the faint scent of fox, but the dog's tail stilled, ears pitching forward, posture alert but without a hint of menace. Jackson followed, boots soft in the damp grass, not hurrying. There was a weight to Bishop's presence now, a stillness he hadn't shown all morning. The mist here moved slower, and the air was colder, heavy with that strange, metallic bite that comes only when something is not as it should be. Then Jackson saw her. A girl, no more than 7, crouched at the base of the willow. She wore a coat too large for her shoulders, its cuffs pulled down over fists that gripped a thin plastic bag. She moved with the furtive energy of the overlooked, every motion careful and small, as if trying to take up less space in the world. On her lap, bundled in a faded flannel, was a baby, a boy, maybe only weeks old, his tiny face half hidden, his skin the blue-white of early morning. The girl's head was bowed, her hair, brown, tangled, streaked with pale autumn dust, curtain across her cheeks. She picked through the grass, fingers seeking out bottle caps, scraps of foil, anything that might be worth a dime at the market's old return counter. She did not look up at the approach of footsteps or the slow, gentle breathing of Bishop. Jackson stopped, not close enough to frighten, but not far enough to be a stranger. He could see the rawness on the girl's knuckles, the stains on the knees of her leggings. Her shoes were more memory than leather, soles patched with tape, socks peeking through holes. She kept her shoulders curled inward, as if the air itself was something to be weathered. Bishop stood between Jackson and the girl now, his form a gentle barrier, not blocking, not guarding, simply present. He took a single step toward the little family, paused, then sat, his tail wrapped around his paws. The dog's ears softened, and he lowered his head, eyes fixed on the baby. There was a kind of old wisdom in that posture, as if he understood exactly what was needed. Nothing sudden, nothing loud, only the warmth of silent company. The girl must have felt it, her shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn to run. Instead, she pressed the baby closer to her chest, rocking ever so slightly, her gaze flicking sideways to the dog. Jackson waited. The willow's shadow stretched between them, a soft green tent shielding the world away. He let his hands hang at his sides, letting the uniform recede, letting the man remain. No words, not yet. Just the soft exhale of breath, the distant cry of a jay, the rustle of willow leaves as the morning wind circled them. Bishop inched closer, his steps slow, deliberate. He stopped within arm's reach, then lowered his body to the ground, head resting on his paws. The girl's eyes lingered on the torn tip of the dog's ear, the way his chest rose and fell, steady as the tide. She watched the patch of fur worn thin by old harness straps, the faded pink of a scar that cut across the dark fur of his brow. She watched, and then, perhaps for the first time all morning, she stopped moving. It was a long time before anyone spoke. The baby whimpered, a frail mewling that faded as quickly as it came. The girl shifted, arms tightening, shoulders curling more. Still, Bishop did not flinch. He only breathed, waiting for her to notice that he would not leave. Jackson knelt, not close, not reaching. His body cast a longer shadow on the grass, his presence heavy but patient. He kept his eyes on the ground, not the girl, letting her own gaze come to him in her own time. He had learned this, had learned how to let pain arrive on its own terms, how to sit with it, how to let it know it was not alone. The girl drew in a sharp breath, the sound of someone bracing for trouble. Still, Jackson did not speak. He watched as Bishop's tail thudded softly once against the ground, a wordless gesture of peace. Finally, the girl lifted her head, just a fraction. Her eyes, startlingly wide, rimmed in tired blue, met the dog's. She searched his face, the way only a child who has known too much can search, for threat or for kindness, for the smallest sign that here, at least, was something that would not break her. What she found was only stillness, only the steady patience of a creature who had waited beside others in worse places, in darker hours. The moment hung there, delicate as frost, a silence so complete that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Jackson felt it, a kind of recognition, a memory of nights on old hospital benches, of hands clasped in prayer, of wanting desperately for someone to notice the small lives overlooked by the rush of the world. Bishop did not move. The girl did not move. Jackson did not move. The willow swayed, the baby slept, and the morning came a little further on. No one in the town square would have seen them, under the willow by the water. An old man, a battered dog, a child holding on to what little she could. and the faintest glimmer of hope in the hush between breaths. The willow's long branches moved like slow fingers above them, the world outside shrinking to a gentle hush. The girl didn't speak. She watched Bishop the way a stray might watch another, not as threat or promise, but as simple presence, something true, something waiting. Jackson knew better than to fill the silence. He watched the way the girl's small hands hovered protectively around the baby, her knuckles white, fingernails bitten. The thin plastic bag, knotted around her wrist, was filled with the modest harvest of the park's edge. A few bottles, a crushed can, a tangle of copper wire someone had left behind. Each item was a currency known best by those who count every dime. He stayed where he was, at the edge of the willow's shade, his own hands visible and calm. There was something in his stance, how his boots pressed evenly into the wet grass, how his shoulders eased, how his gaze rested not on her, but on the lake beyond. He wanted to make it clear, I am not here to hurry you. I am not here to decide for you. Bishop waited as only dogs can wait, his whole body slack, tail curled, eyes open but soft. The question of trust posed not with bark or wag, but with patience. After a time he shifted, inching a little closer, his head still low. He let out a breath, a sound more felt than heard. Rosie, the name would come later, turned just slightly, enough for Jackson to see the curve of her cheek, the arc of a bruise fading from purple to green. The morning air carried a trace of wood smoke from a distant chimney. In the spaces between, the world was silent except for the sigh of Bishop's breathing, the small, thin sounds of a baby's dreaming, the secret music of a park waking without witnesses. The world was, for a while, nothing but this, a patch of grass beneath a willow, the slow arrival of trust. At last, the girl loosened her grip on the plastic bag. Her hands shook, but she did not cry. Instead, she touched the baby's head, tucking a bit of flannel beneath his chin. The gesture was so practiced, so careful, that Jackson felt his own chest ache with memory, of small hands in his own, of bedtime songs sung to a half-dark room, of a life before loss had quieted every joy. He reached into his coat pocket, slow and deliberate, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A receipt, nothing more. With a bit of the willow's broken twig, he set to sketching, careful lines of a dog, a tree, a lake. Bishop's image emerged with each stroke, one ear bent, the body sturdy but tired, the nose almost smiling. When he was finished, Jackson set the paper on the grass, not offering it but simply leaving it in the space between. The girl eyed it, her expression unreadable, as if she were measuring its worth. She said nothing. Instead, she let her gaze settle again on Bishop. The dog had turned to face her fully, his nose resting against her shin, the faint warmth of his breath fogging just above her worn shoe. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, without warning, she reached down, tentative, and brushed her fingertips against the fur behind Bishop's ear. The dog did not flinch. Jackson let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Still, he did not speak. This moment was not for words. It was for the hush that comes when caution gives way, just a little, to connection. A pair of crows called to each other across the water, breaking the stillness, but not the spell. The girl straightened, brushing hair from her eyes with the back of her hand. She glanced once at Jackson, quickly away again. There was a question in her eyes, but not the one he was used to. No fear, no accusation, only the quiet, hungry hope that maybe, just maybe, someone had come who would not ask too much, who would not demand what she could not give. Bishop shifted, his weight leaning ever so slightly against the girl's leg. The baby stirred, a tiny fist pressing up from the blanket. The girl responded as if she'd done it 1,000 times, gently rocking, her eyes growing distant, focused on keeping the little life in her arms calm and warm. Jackson stood, brushing dew from his knees. He moved to the edge of the clearing, looking out at the pale blue of the lake, letting the girl and the dog fill the space behind him. It was an old habit, this giving of room, this invitation for others to join or not, without pressure. Bishop stayed close to Rosie, a silent guardian. Jackson waited, present but not imposing. The light was changing now, the sun reaching above the trees, throwing long gold stripes across the grass. Somewhere in town, a bell chimed, a far-off sign that the world had begun. Here, though, time drifted, unmeasured. Only then did the girl speak, her voice soft, raw as wind, hardly more than a thread. "Will he bite?" Jackson didn't turn, only let a smile touch his voice. "No," he said. "He knows when to be gentle." It was all that needed to be said. Bishop pressed his head a little harder against her knee, and the girl, unseen by anyone but the willow and the sun, let herself believe, if only for this small, silent moment, that she could rest. The world under the willow had shifted in its silence, a new shape formed by the nearness of a dog's patient warmth and a child's fragile trust. Bishop stayed pressed against the girl's shin, as if he'd always known she would need a sentinel more than a savior. Jackson remained at the edge, letting the cool air settle and the hush take root, until it felt natural to step forward. He moved without hurry, careful not to startle. The willow leaves brushed against his sleeve, leaving tiny beads of dew. In one hand, he carried a plain cotton handkerchief, clean, folded, soft from years of washing. He offered it to the girl, but not directly. Instead, he set it beside her, close enough for her to take if she wished, far enough to not crowd her with pity. There was no suggestion, no encouragement. Just an object left, a sign, "You matter." The girl's hand, wary but steady, reached for the cloth. She wiped at her fingers slowly, one by one, removing the residue of dirt and old syrup from scavenged bottles. When she was done, she held the handkerchief to her cheek for a moment, breathing in a scent of clean cotton and wood smoke. She didn't give it back. Jackson eased himself down on the old wooden bench that sat beneath the willow, paint peeling, a little slanted, but sturdy. He set a battered thermos on the seat beside him, unscrewed the lid, and poured warm water into the cup. He didn't say, "Come drink." Instead, he cradled the cup in both hands, letting the steam drift upward, and placed it on the ground, halfway between himself and the girl. There was a time when he would have spoken, when he might have tried to reassure her with promises or gentle questions. But loss had taught him that some wounds do not welcome words, that sometimes presence itself is the only kindness. Bishop stretched, rolling onto his side, his head resting near the thermos cup. His breath misted against the grass. The girl watched the dog, then the cup. The baby slept, fists curled, face hidden beneath a too small cap, breathing soft as the fog above the lake. With a glance at Jackson, quick, cautious, not quite pleading, the girl took the cup, holding it with both hands, sipping in small, careful swallows. The heat flushed her cheeks, thawed the red from her knuckles. She paused to let the baby rest against her shoulder, then drank again, slower this time. The gesture was almost ceremonial, the way old folks might treat tea on a cold day, a small, private warmth, cherished in silence. Around them, the park slowly woke. A pair of squirrels darted along the fence, Somewhere a bus groaned into motion. Still, the willow's corner remained separate, the hush inside holding a different kind of time. Jackson watched her drink, watched Bishop nuzzle the baby's leg with his nose. Gentle, slow, instinctively careful. Rosie, though he did not know her name yet, let out a tiny breath, the kind that comes after holding fear too long. She set the cup down and brushed the dog's ear again, just once, then kept her hand there. Jackson, still not speaking, reached into his coat for a small, square napkin and set a handful of crackers on its fold. He set it beside the cup, making no fuss. The baby stirred. The girl tore a cracker in half, dipped it in the cup to soften it, and pressed a piece gently to the baby's lips. Jack's mouth worked reflexively, seeking the comfort he could not name. The girl smiled then, just a quick, vanishing spark, but Jackson saw it, and so did Bishop. The bench creaked as Jackson shifted, letting his legs stretch, his back settle into the worn wood. He gazed out at the lake. The fog was lifting now, the first rays of gold streaking across the water. Leaves fell, one at a time, their descent so quiet it was almost reverent. Bishop licked the baby's tiny fingers. Rosie didn't flinch. Instead, she laid her hand flat on Bishop's side, feeling the steady thrum of his breath, the rise and fall of his chest. It was a rhythm older than language, a comfort older than reason. Sometimes, a dog's heartbeat is the first place a frightened child finds their own. No one hurried. The world outside kept moving, but here, the pace belonged to the tired, the cautious, and the kind. The simple act of sharing, water, cloth, heat, built a kind of shelter no building could hold. Jackson leaned back, folded his hands in his lap, and let the quiet remain. There was healing, too, in the ordinary. A crust of bread shared, a handkerchief held close, a cup of warmth passed back and forth. Bishop stood as the silent witness to it all. Every so often, he would look up at Jackson as if to say, "This is enough. This is what we're for." The girl's guard dropped, fraction by fraction, as Bishop stayed near and Jackson stayed patient. The baby shifted in sleep, content. Bishop yawned, wide and slow, then closed his eyes. No one in the town would notice 3 figures beneath the willow that morning. No one would see the way pain softened in the warmth of a shared cup, a borrowed cloth, and a dog's steady breath. But sometimes, the greatest kindness is the one no one names. Sometimes, it is simply sitting still long enough for another to find a moment of rest. Sometimes, the smallest acts are the ones that heal what the world could not. The wind shifted, drawing a low sigh through the willow's draping boughs. The hush in that corner of the park was the kind that asked the world to slow down and listen, not for words, but for the rhythm of small things. A baby's exhale, the patter of falling leaves, a dog's even breath. Sunlight pressed uncertainly through the green, making dappled patterns on the grass, on the sleeve of Jackson's old coat, on the tiny hand that clutched at Rosie's shoulder. Time held itself loosely, as if giving permission for a moment of ordinary mercy. Jackson didn't press for answers. Instead, he shifted his weight on the bench and traced the grain of the wood with his thumb, listening to the silence as if it were its own kind of music. He was not a man who rushed, not anymore. He'd learned that wounded creatures, animal or human, needed space, not speeches. Beside him, Bishop lifted his head, sniffed the cool air, and let it go with a gentle huff, as if confirming that the world could wait. It was Rosie who broke the silence, though not with certainty. Her voice was hardly there, caught halfway between wanting to ask for help and wanting only to be left unseen. She looked at Jackson, but spoke to the ground, her words so quiet that they could almost be mistaken for the wind. "I just want to stay with my brother. Please don't take us away." The words seemed to echo, suspended in the hush. For a moment, nothing moved, except Bishop, who edged closer and rested his muzzle on her knee. The warmth of his body, a silent promise. Jackson nodded, the movement small, more for himself than for her. He remembered how, years before, his own daughter would come to him in the dark, asking only for the comfort of being near, of not having to explain her fears or her sadness. He recognized the trembling in Rosie's voice. It was the sound of a child who had already learned the world could be quick to judge and slow to understand. He didn't offer easy words. He only let the quiet stretch, smoothing it out so Rosie's fears had room to breathe. The sound of the baby stirring drew all eyes. Jack, still wrapped in his threadbare blanket, blinked up at the sun, lips working. Rosie cradled him closer, pressing her cheek to the top of his head. Bishop lifted his nose and nudged the tiny fist peeking from the bundle. Jack's hand, barely big enough to wrap around a thumb, found its way into the dog's fur, gripping tight. For the first time, Rosie's mouth softened at the corners. Not a full smile, just the glimmer of one, so fleeting Jackson nearly missed it. Still, he felt it in his chest, like the smallest crack of light at the edge of a heavy curtain. The willow's shadow wrapped the trio in gentle green. A breeze rustled, and a handful of yellow leaves drifted down, catching in Rosie's hair on Bishop's back. She brushed one leaf off the baby's cheek and for a long moment simply held her brother and let herself breathe in the comfort of Bishop's nearness. Jackson reached for a stick, drawing slow circles in the dirt by his boots, letting the action speak for him. He thought of all the forms, the protocols, the rules stacked up in the office downtown, rules that rarely asked how a child survived the night, or what it cost a brother and sister to stay together when the world was cold. He felt the weight of his badge, and the heavier, softer weight of responsibility, one that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with kindness. He cleared his throat, more to test his own voice than to break the spell. "You're safe here," he said simply, not adding anything more. It was the truth, and the truth was enough for now. Bishop, hearing Jackson's tone, rolled onto his back and let his paws fall in the soft grass, a gesture of absolute trust. Rosie looked at the old dog and, for a single bright second, she giggled, the sound half-formed and surprising, as if she'd forgotten she could make such a noise. Jack, startled by the vibration in his sister's arms, yawned, eyes wide as pennies. Jackson watched them and thought of all the times he'd wished for such ordinary sounds. The giggle, the baby's sigh, the gentle scrape of a paw on autumn earth. He let the memory settle, heavy and light at once, the way only the truest losses ever can be. No one hurried the moment. Rosie began humming softly, a tune with no words. Jackson listened, eyes on the way Bishop stretched in the sun, ears relaxed, eyes almost closed. For just that sliver of morning, the world was right. 3 souls, each battered in their way, finding rest in the shade of an old tree. A pair of joggers passed on the far path. A dog barked, distant and cheerful. The hush beneath the willow held its ground. Rosie stroked Bishop's fur, her words spent for now. She did not ask for a promise. She did not demand a plan. She only stayed, as still and hopeful as the leaf-littered earth beneath her. Jackson, for his part, offered nothing but presence. A man sitting quietly, waiting for trust to bloom, letting love for once do the work of explanation. The willow's green lace trembled as the wind shifted again, the kind of wind that hints at winter pressing against the gold of late autumn. The hush had lengthened, become companionable. Rosie leaned into Bishop's warmth, the baby pressed close, her small body anchored in the certainty of a living, breathing presence that would not leave. Jackson watched the sunlight catch in the child's hair and thought of how quiet love can be, how it moves beneath notice, how it keeps lives from drifting apart. Eventually, when the baby slept again and Rosie's breaths had evened, Jackson asked, voice barely above a whisper, "How long have you been here?" His words didn't disturb the stillness. They entered it as if part of the wind. Rosie's eyes traced the patterns on the back of Bishop's neck. Her answer came slow, the truth carried on the hush between the trees. "Since the nights got cold. We came when Gran couldn't wake up anymore. Mama went before that, after Jack was born." She blinked, as if surprised she'd spoken at all. Jackson listened, hands folded, one finger absently stroking the wood grain of the bench. He didn't write anything down. He didn't mention shelters or social workers or the long arm of the county. He only let the moment fill itself. Let Rosie's words hang like leaves that do not want to fall. Bishop shifted closer to the girl, tongue flicking over her scraped knuckles. He pressed his shoulder into her side, a living buffer against the cold, against the fear that still clung like old smoke. The dog's presence was wordless, and for Rosie, more certain than any promise. Jackson's mind flickered to his own shadows, those rooms at the edge of memory where the past gathers dust. He thought of his daughter's laughter echoing through the old house. The afternoon her fever broke, only for a colder illness to settle in days later. He'd learned then how silence can fill every room, how an empty chair at the kitchen table can haunt every morning. Sometimes grief, he'd realized, is not the storm, but the quiet after the rain. Rosie's face, thin and chapped, turned toward him. "Gran used to say, 'We're not poor, just unlucky.' She said people in this town only look away because they don't want to see themselves. I think maybe she was right." She paused, studying Bishop as if seeking an answer in the softness of his muzzle. "Mama left a note. She said she'd come back, but..." The rest drifted away, unfinished. Jackson nodded, feeling the sting of truth. There are people who mean to return, but the world finds a way to keep them moving. He wondered if Rosie's mother lay awake at night, thinking of the two children beside a lake, or if she'd simply slipped into the long forgetting. A silence passed, deep and long, made gentle by Bishop's presence, by the baby's slow, even breaths. The willow leaves trembled above them, shaking loose the last golden fragments. The girl brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, her hand trembling just a little. She glanced up at Jackson, then quickly away. He could have offered explanations about the systems that sometimes help and sometimes fail, about how kindness is too often measured in paperwork and protocol. But he knew better. Sometimes the only gift you can give is not leaving. Bishop shifted again, nosing the baby's tiny fist. The old dog's eyes were tired, rimmed with the wisdom of 1,000 quiet moments, of days spent watching over people who didn't know how to be watched. He laid his chin in Rosie's lap, and the girl's hand found its way to his head, fingers threading the rough fur. "Gran said Bishop was a hero once," Rosie whispered, her gaze distant. "I saw him in the newspaper. She cut it out and taped it to our fridge. She said he saved someone from the river after the flood." She looked at Jackson then, a question in her eyes. "Is that true?" Jackson smiled softly, something old and aching flickering across his face. "It's true," he said. "He's saved more than he'll ever know, sometimes just by staying close." Rosie let the words settle. She traced the scar on Bishop's ear with the tip of her finger, her face thoughtful. "Gran said people remember heroes, but they forget the lonely," she said. "Be the kind of person who stays." Jackson looked away, toward the water. In the far distance, a fisherman's boat drifted, barely a shape in the morning haze. He wondered if the man on that boat understood anything about loss, about hanging on, about the small acts of courage required simply to last the day. Rosie rested her head on Bishop's shoulder, eyes closing for a moment. Jack slept on, breath steady, his small hand never leaving the fur at his side. The three of them, a child, a dog, a baby, looked like a prayer made visible, a petition for gentleness in a world too often unkind. Jackson breathed in the scent of earth and cold and old willow, the sweetness of wood smoke on Rosie's handkerchief, the almost imperceptible perfume of childhood carried on a dog's coat. He let himself believe, for a moment, that time could be kind, that shadows might stretch without swallowing the light entirely. The park's sounds returned. Footsteps in the distance, a dog barking at the water's edge, the low clatter of a passing bike. Still, beneath the willow, the hush endured. Here, memory and hope touched, neither demanding explanation, and for that brief, precious spell, no one was left behind. By late morning, the sky had brightened enough to erase the last blue shadows under the willow, but the cold still clung to the grass, and every breath steamed. Jackson stood first, brushing the dew from his coat, then offered Rosie a gentle nod, as if to say the world beyond their small refuge could wait a little longer for her to trust it. She gathered up the plastic bag, tucked the handkerchief into her pocket, and lifted Jack, who whimpered but did not wake. The town was starting to move now. Hallow Creek was not a place for spectacle, but people noticed things, especially the slow procession across the park. A police officer, a thin girl, a bundled infant, and an old dog with one ear bent like a half-forgotten page in a storybook. They passed the bakery, its windows fogged with warmth and the promise of cinnamon. A man behind the counter paused his sweeping and watched them go. Outside the hardware store, two women in quilted coats spoke in low voices, their eyes following Rosie with something like worry, something like regret. Jackson didn't hurry. He let Rosie set the pace, small steps, careful, as if afraid of being called out or called back. Bishop stayed at her side, matching her stride, neither pulling nor lagging, a silent guardian. Sometimes Rosie's hand dropped to rest on Bishop's head, a fleeting touch as natural as drawing breath. At the corner, a school bus shuddered to a stop, and a handful of children spilled out, scarves trailing behind them, their voices bright in the thin air. One girl, a little older than Rosie, stopped and stared. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. Her eyes held a recognition that Jackson saw, and wondered if Rosie felt it too. The silent knowledge of what it means to be on the outside of things, to carry a secret you can't name. They turned toward the police station, its brick walls holding the chill like a deep pond in winter. Jackson pushed open the heavy glass door, its hinges groaning. The station smelled of old coffee and paper, the faint trace of floor polish. There was a hush inside, the kind that always fell when an officer brought in something delicate, a wounded animal, a lost child, a situation that did not fit the lines of any form. Sergeant Macy, at the front desk, looked up from her paperwork. She was older than Jackson by a handful of years, her hair the color of ash, eyes ringed with exhaustion and patience. She didn't ask questions. She nodded toward the back office and went to fill a kettle, her movements efficient, unhurried. Jackson guided Rosie and Jack to a couch near the window, its cushions sunken, its fabric worn thin by years of nervous waiting. Bishop hopped up, settling himself at Rosie's feet, chin on his paws, eyes sweeping the room. Rosie perched on the edge of the cushion, her plastic bag still clutched in one hand, the other wrapped around Jack. Her body was tense, ready to flee if the wrong word was said. Jackson knelt to her level, resting his elbows on his knees. He didn't touch her, didn't even reach for Jack. He only sat and waited for her to let the stillness fill the space. He knew what came next. The paperwork, the calls to social services, the questions about next of kin and legal guardians. He'd done it before, too many times, and he'd seen how easily children slipped between the cracks. How the law, meant to protect, sometimes became a wall that separated what was left of a family. Sergeant Macy returned with a mug of warm milk and a sleeve of crackers. She set them on the table, then knelt in front of Rosie, her voice as soft as dusk. "You can rest here for a while, honey. No one's going to take your brother unless you say so. Not today." Rosie's eyes shone with a wary hope, the kind that flickers and fades if you look at it too long. She fed Jack a softened cracker, her hands steady now, her breathing easier. Jackson rose, moving to the window, staring out at the line of oaks that ringed the square. His reflection stared back, older than he remembered, more tired. He thought of his daughter's empty room, the box of dolls packed away, the hush that settled every night in a house built for more voices than his own. He thought of the rules, the ones he'd sworn to uphold, the ones that never asked what it would cost a child to lose the last person she loved. He thought of Rosie's whispered plea, the weight of Jack in her arms, the way Bishop never left her side. The rules said call for help, trust the system, step aside. But the heart, wounded and wiser, asked something else. Stay, protect, make room for one more story under your roof. Outside, the bakery door swung open. The man inside set a small box of rolls on the steps. No one saw him do it. Across the street, the schoolgirl who had watched Rosie pulled something from her pocket, a worn blue ribbon, and tied it to the iron fence, a small signal, a bit of color on a gray day. Inside, Bishop thumped his tail once against the floor. Rosie finally looked up, meeting Jackson's eyes without fear. For a moment, all the noise in the world seemed to pause. Jackson nodded, small, certain. He knew then what his decision would be, though the paperwork and the questions would come. Some things were worth the risk. Some families are built from what's left behind, gathered from the edges, made whole not by blood, but by the quiet choosing to stay. And so, as the town kept moving outside, and the office filled with the faint scent of cinnamon from the box on the steps, Jackson sat beside Rosie and Bishop and Jack, and let himself believe, just for a moment, that maybe for once the rules could bend to kindness. By afternoon, word had already begun to move through Hallow Creek. Not in shouts or headlines, but in the quiet way that small towns have for letting news drift from stoop to counter to kitchen table. Some learned it at the bakery, where the smell of cinnamon was joined now by the hush of voices speaking Rosie's name, the soft uncertainty of a baby's fate. Others caught it at the hardware store, in the exchange of glances between neighbors, a slight pause at the register as hands lingered over change. Inside the police station, sunlight stretched long across the floor, catching on the dust motes that rose every time Bishop shifted his weight. Rosie and Jack had settled on the old couch, the baby asleep. Rosie curled around him, her small frame tucked as if she meant to make a shield of her body. Jackson sat nearby, his posture quiet, hands folded in his lap. Sergeant Macy returned with a wool blanket, one she kept in the trunk of her car for emergencies, and tucked it around the children without a word. Outside, a soft knock sounded at the glass door. It was Mrs. Lindstrom from the flower shop, her arms cradling a knitted scarf, red and thick. She stepped inside, her voice a hush, as she handed it to Jackson. "For the girl, if she'll have it." Before Jackson could thank her, she was gone, her footsteps swallowed by the hush of the street. Soon after, Mr. Rossetti, the baker, entered, a carton of warm milk in one hand and a brown paper bag in the other. He left both on the front counter, nodding once at Sergeant Macy, who only smiled and said nothing. From the window, Jackson saw more signs of quiet giving. A teenager from the high school crossing the square, a paper bag of groceries held against his chest, cheeks pink with the effort. He stopped by the door, set down the bag, and vanished into the stream of late-day errands. Someone else, a grandmother in a faded raincoat, paused to hang a knitted mitten on the fence outside, then hurried away before anyone could greet her. Each gesture came without fanfare, each gift unwrapped, unsaid. Rosie saw it too from her place on the couch. She traced the red scarf's cable stitches with her finger, lips parted in surprise. Bishop nudged her elbow, then turned to stare at the bag of groceries, tail thumping once as if in approval. There were no speeches, no grand declarations, only the slow, steady build of kindness, layer by layer. The kind that grew not from pity, but from recognition. The town saw Rosie, saw Jack, and in some way saw a part of themselves, some old hurt, some lost moment, some hunger for gentleness. Jackson watched all this with a heart pulled in two directions. He felt the ache of old discipline, the years spent building walls, holding to duty, keeping his emotions tightly wound. But he also felt something loosening, an old knot undone by the simplicity of these offerings. He saw it in Rosie's eyes, how each new kindness made her a little less small, a little more at home in her own skin. Sergeant Macy moved through the room, gathering notes, answering the rare call, her presence as steady as the sun in the late afternoon. When she passed Rosie, she paused, reached down, and straightened the edge of the blanket, her fingers lingering just a moment on the girl's shoulder. The baby, Jack, woke with a snuffling cry, fists waving at the air. Rosie soothed him with the grace of someone twice her age, whispering nonsense, her voice a song meant only for his ears. Bishop stood, stretched, then circled to the other side of the couch, pressing his body close enough to offer warmth. After a time, children from the elementary school filed in, each clutching a piece of colored paper, a card, a drawing, a note written in careful, earnest letters. One by one, they handed their offerings to Rosie, who blushed deep as the red scarf, nodding her thanks, her eyes wide and wet. Jackson knelt beside her, helping her stack the cards. One showed a girl with brown hair holding hands with a tall police officer and a dog, the sun smiling down on all three. Another showed a baby in a bundle of blue, surrounded by hearts. There were words too. "We're glad you're here. You're safe now. Bishop is my hero." Rosie read each note in silence, lips moving with the words, letting the truth of them sink past the walls she had built in her short, hard life. The silence that followed was not empty. but full. The silence of a room where pain is met, at last, by belonging. Outside, dusk crept across the square, setting the windows ablaze with gold. The smell of bread, of wool, of paper and ink filled the little station. Jackson sat with Rosie and Jack and Bishop, the cards spread before them, the gifts gathered close. He did not speak, for there was nothing to say that would not pale beside what was happening on its own. In that slow, gentle hour, the town gathered itself around the children, not in noise but in presence. Each small act wove into the next, a tapestry of comfort laid quiet and strong. Jackson, looking at Rosie's face, now softer, less shadowed, felt the warmth of what had been given, and what perhaps could still be. Kindness, he realized, was not a single gesture. It was the accumulation of many hands, many hearts, and the willingness to see what is small and frail and worth loving, no matter how quietly it arrives. The night deepened over Hallow Creek, pressing a hush into every street and alley, covering the town's tired rooftops with silver. Inside the station, time seemed to slow in answer. A lamp glowed softly in the front window, drawing a golden pool across the floor where Bishop now slept, paws twitching as if chasing some gentle memory in his dreams. Rosie sat beside her brother on the couch, the red scarf wrapped tight around her neck, the wool blanket tucked beneath her chin. The day's kindnesses surrounded her in small, concrete ways, the half-empty cup of warm milk, the soft pile of children's drawings, the basket of rolls now covered and cooling on the desk. Yet it was not the gifts themselves that changed the air, but the way they had quietly gathered, growing heavier and lighter all at once. The station was quiet, save for the tick of the clock and the even, sleeping breath of Jack. Sergeant Macy had gone home, leaving Jackson alone with the children and Bishop. The old dog stirred, looked up at Rosie, then moved to the window, sitting sentry in the shadows. The quiet felt thick with possibility, a kind of suspended hope. Jackson busied himself in the tiny kitchenette, washing a mug, drying it, setting it down, picking it up again. He felt in every movement the weight of a choice forming, old habits rising in protest. He'd lived by the rules so long they sometimes sounded like his own thoughts. Don't get too close. Don't bring trouble home. Don't want what can't be kept. But there were other voices, too. Softer, harder to dismiss. You could try. You could stay. He glanced through the open doorway. Saw Rosie was awake, eyes fixed on the moonlight striping the far wall. He watched the slow, cautious rise and fall of her chest, the way she drew close to her brother, then, as if by some instinct, reached to touch Bishop's paw as the dog returned to her side. Jackson crossed the room and sat near, not crowding, only present. Bishop settled between them, his tail sweeping the floor in slow, steady arcs. The moment was a kind of crossroads, yet neither Jackson nor Rosie seemed eager to fill it with talk. Instead, it was Rosie who finally broke the silence, her voice so soft it seemed made of mist. "Will you send us away now?" She didn't look at Jackson, only pressed her cheek to Jack's soft head, eyes fixed on some invisible point across the room. The question wasn't new. It was a shape she'd carried in every muscle and breath since they met. But now it was out in the open, bare and trembling. Jackson let the words sit. He could have said many things, the rules, the process, the hopeful promises of a system that didn't always hold. But what he offered was only this. You belong together. That matters more than anything. He let the quiet fill in what he couldn't say. The clock ticked. Bishop's chest rose and fell. Rosie shivered and drew her knees to her chest, the blanket wrapped tight. She stared at her shoes, at the threads unraveling from the toes, and Jackson wondered how many nights she'd hidden her fear beneath that same quiet gaze. He remembered his own daughter, how she'd asked once, in a whisper much like Rosie's, if the world ever stopped hurting. He'd told her the truth. Sometimes, not for long. But there were people who could make it softer. In the hush, Bishop moved closer to Rosie, pressing his nose against her arm. She let her head fall until her hair spilled over her cheeks, and her shoulders shook, not with sobbing, but with the long, slow exhale of someone letting go. "I just want to stay," she whispered. "I don't want anyone to take us away. Not ever again." Jackson sat with that plea, felt it settle into the old ache in his chest, the ache he'd carried since loss became his shadow. For a long time he did nothing. Then, quietly, he reached out and laid his hand on Bishop's back. The dog turned, looking at his old friend, eyes bright in the half-light. The clock moved toward midnight. The station, wrapped in hush, felt less like a workplace and more like a home with all the lights left on. Jackson heard the wind tap at the glass, the sound of something, maybe hope, asking to be let in. He met Rosie's gaze at last, saw in her eyes the stubborn, unbroken will to stay, to be seen and chosen. He saw his own longing reflected back, his need to fill the empty spaces left behind, his wish to say yes even when the world would say no. He didn't make a promise. He didn't say forever. He only moved closer, let Rosie's small hand rest in his, and Bishop's warm weight anchor them both. In that long, sacred pause, something shifted. Not a solution, not an answer, but a beginning. Outside, the town's windows glowed. Late lamps, kitchen lights, porch bulbs left burning for those not yet home. The hush in the station grew gentler, thicker, the kind that says, "Stay a little longer, let the world wait." In the morning, there would be paperwork and questions, and decisions that might be hard to defend. But tonight, in the deep stillness, Jackson chose to stay, with the children, with Bishop, with the hard hope that even broken things can be made whole by kindness, and by the choice to not let go. A year passed, measured not in grand events but in slow turnings. Winter dissolving into spring, the lake shedding its skin of ice, wild geese returning to the hush of early mornings. In Hallow Creek, the trees along the water swelled green and gold, and then dropped their leaves again, circling the seasons back to the same quiet bench beneath the willow. It was there one soft afternoon that Jackson sat watching Rosie and Jack, the two of them now a familiar sight in the town, woven into its gentle routines. Jack had grown from a bundle of flannel into a boy with bright eyes and sturdy hands. Rosie was taller, still thin, but with a new assurance to her step, the look of a child who had been claimed by belonging. At her side, Bishop stretched in the pale sunlight, muzzle gone grayer, eyes warm and at ease, the scar on his ear only a memory now softened by time. Rosie sat with her back against the bench, a book open in her lap, her voice lifting and falling in the quiet music of reading aloud. Jack lay sprawled on the grass, his head in her lap, fingers twisting the long blades. Every so often, Bishop rolled onto his side, offering his belly for Jack's clumsy affection, and the boy giggled, a sound that seemed to catch in the golden air and linger. Jackson watched, a cup of coffee cooling beside him, hands wrapped around the warmth. He did not intrude on their circle, but let the peace settle around him. The ache of old grief was there, as it always would be, but it no longer pressed so hard against his ribs. Instead, something looser, lighter, a gratitude for what had grown from the hardest season of his life. Sometimes, he caught Rosie looking his way, and she'd smile, small but certain, as if sharing a secret only they understood. Bishop, ever watchful, lay between them, his chest rising and falling in a slow, contented rhythm. Occasionally, he would lift his head and look toward Jackson, eyes full of quiet meaning. Jackson liked to think the dog understood it all, the weight of sorrow, the persistence of hope, the ordinary magic of people and animals simply refusing to give up on each other. No one spoke of the year before, of that long cold morning or the fears that had filled it. The story had folded itself into the gentle habits of daily living, shared meals at the kitchen table, muddy boots at the door, the soft slap of Jack's feet on the porch. Townsfolk who had once looked with curiosity now waved as they passed, dropping off loaves of bread or a bouquet of wildflowers, gestures that needed no explanation. Rosie sometimes brought home drawings from school, pictures of Bishop beneath the willow, Jack in the crook of her arm, Jackson at their side, the sun shining overhead. She tacked them up on the fridge, each one a silent tally of days survived and cherished. Bishop's own picture, from a child's hand, bore the word hero in crooked, colorful letters. Jackson had framed it quietly and set it on his desk. There were still hard days, mornings when the ache of absence pressed heavy, when Rosie's voice went small and Jack's fingers clung too tightly to his sister's hand. But there were more good days than bad. There were days when Bishop chased a squirrel through the garden, when laughter spilled across the kitchen floor, when Rosie and Jack lay in the sun with their heads on Bishop's side and let the world spin on outside. Sometimes Jackson found himself awake in the night, listening to the sound of the children breathing in their beds, the soft patter of Bishop's paws as he made his rounds through the darkened house. He would sit at the window and watch the moon slide over the lake, thinking not of what had been lost, but of what had been gathered, quietly, stubbornly, through the simple act of staying. In the gentle quiet of that autumn afternoon, the lesson was there, woven through the sunlight, the fallen leaves, the patient circle of trust that had grown up beneath the willow. Kindness, Jackson realized, was not always loud. Sometimes it was just the refusal to let go. Sometimes it was the old dog who never left a child's side. Sometimes it was the slow, careful way a man reached out a hand, again and again, until the hand was taken. As the sun began to sink behind the line of trees, Rosie closed her book and looked up at Jackson. She smiled, and Jack sat up, sleepy and content, reaching for Bishop's ear. The dog leaned into the touch, eyes closing in pleasure. Jackson took a slow breath, letting it fill him with something close to peace. He looked at Rosie, at Jack, at Bishop, and then at the world beyond, painted gold by the day's end. There was no need for words, not now. The story had said what it needed to say. The town, the willow, the children, the old dog, all bore silent witness to a truth stronger than explanation, that even those the world overlooks, those once seen as less, can become the quiet heart of a family, the soul of a small town, the keepers of its best, most steadfast love. And so, as dusk deepened, and Bishop's tail thumped softly in the leaves, Jackson smiled into the gathering dark. Some stories were made not of miracles, but of patience, kindness, and the ordinary courage it takes to stay. In the soft hush beneath the willow, where old wounds are tended not with grand gestures but with patience and presence, you can almost believe that kindness will outlast even the hardest season. Sometimes, a home is made not from walls or names, but from those willing to stay, to listen, to offer warmth when the world turns cold. In the steady breath of an old dog, the laughter of a child who learns to trust again, and the quiet courage of a man who chooses to love when it isn't easy, we find the real measure of family. If this story touched a memory or longing in you, I invite you to share your own moment of unexpected kindness below. Maybe you too have known the healing of a gentle paw, or the courage it takes to keep someone close. Your words might be the comfort another heart needs tonight. Thank you for being here, for letting these small lives remind us all. Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that change us most.